text, if you're trying to figure out where we are in that cataloging events, approximately 2 Kings chapter 18 through the 25th chapter, or if you're looking at the Chronicle text, that's 2 Chronicles 29 to 36, obviously the ends of those. If you're looking in the workbook or the emails that get sent out, it's towards lesson 32-ish range, 31, 32 in the printed workbooks. But more specifically, right now, we're talking about the end of Judah and the southern kingdom. That then sets us up for the period of captivity and paying attention to the historical events surrounding the last literature prophets before we move into paying attention to the history and geography of that intertestamental period. It's about a 400-year space of information and things to just think about to make sure we get a good handle on what precedes the arrival of the last prophets of the Old Testament, which is Jesus and John, and they are the ones who serve in those roles. But at this time, let's go ahead and bow together in prayer as we begin our study together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today and the time we share together in spiritual things. We thank you for the joy that is found in your word and your message. Help us as Bible students to be good listeners and to be good learners, to be careful and patient, to allow our understanding and knowledge to converge in our growth and maturity. And all this we ask in the name of your Son. Amen. All right, so as mentioned already, we're thinking through the closing aspects of Judah. We've got a couple of notable things to think about. Just like we did last week, we'll do a little bit today. That is, make those interconnections between the biblical text and the record that's there and some of the historical information that is supportive or parallel in timeline to some of these events. The reasons for doing that are consistent in that it helps us get a better grasp of the context, culture, and community of these biblical texts. Understanding where a person is helps you understand the messages that get sent to them. Information like that is very familiar to us. If I were to send you all a handbook on how to drive a mule team, how much practical use would a handbook on how to drive a mule team be to all of us? I mean,
not unless the mule's ready.
Yeah, unless we're ready to switch our way up to the job, right? And so that handbook has a kind of like a boundary of value on it in the sense of the information inside of it. And yet, it doesn't mean the information isn't useful once we have that context. I've said this before, I'll say it again. My family used to have a softball team at a grouping of family reunions that were all kind of related. And we were referred to, this is appropriate if you understand the American Southwest. There's a lot of mules there. And so we were the Martin Mules. It's also appropriate if you know the disposition of my family and our ability to be instantly stubborn for absolutely no reason. And so maybe there's probably some value to the insights in how to drive a mule team if you're trying to figure out what to do with a Martin. That's probably some intertextual value there. The same thing is true in the context of the Bible. Some things do not change because the spiritual or ethical culture changes around it. As an example, we'll talk today a little bit about Hezekiah's tunnel. The process and function of a water system in a society in a city in antiquity is fairly consistent no matter where they are. Whether they are in North America, as we refer to our content, South America, the Asian space of history and antiquity, that is, the Orient goes all the way from Japan in antiquity terminologies, moving all the way over to our area of Mesopotamia. That's all the Orient. And all of those things function the same way because that's how water works underground, and that's how streams and karfs and various water systems function. And so these are things that are very consistent. So when we pay attention to God's people building one, we know and kind of learn, hey, this is the way they did things then. And we do things a little differently now because we've figured out a different system of doing so. So, thinking in this context, remember the first fall period is the mid to early 700s, 731 is our typical cap date for that. This is now talking about the other major grouping of fall and captivity, and it's angling towards our 586 time stamp. And so these are the major aspects of it. There's some things to pay attention when these stories are being relayed to us, in that gradually the captivity rolls out into occupation space. So even though the major clumping of captives are pulled off by the end of this time frame, in the end of this, remember that this is slowly peeled away from them. Where you're essentially peeling out the husk of Israel to the point that there's nothing much left. So Judah is now feeling the heavy hand of Assyria. Remember, Assyria is seen for our perspectives, with Tilgath-Pileser as its first king of note for this context, to be one who is very vicious, very ruthless, and seems to have a perspective that devalues human life to the point that they don't care in the same way that you or I might. So a lot of times we're reading through these last sections of the Old Testament's record of this part of the divided kingdom, we're going to see the various kings engage in the kind of behavior that rightfully will cause us a lot of emotional turmoil, disgust perhaps. Keep in mind, though, it's nothing new. It goes throughout the history of humanity. Judges opens and closes with things that are just as awful, just as debased and horrible. So Judah, in this compressed space now, is also being troubled by their perennial challenges of the Edomites and the Philistines. You would have thought that they would have figured out a solution to these contexts when they had the great might of David or the great wisdom and wealth of Solomon, but they were not either willing or committed to eradicating that problem from their area. It might tell you something about how we think we can solve problems sometimes. We also kind of think, well, if we put enough of our mind to it, we can solve anything. You had, in the case of both of those two kings, great might and then great wisdom and wealth. That should have been enough, right? It wasn't. So there's certainly other things going on, either God's hands, spiritual considerations, the greater conflict in play. At this time frame, though, we have a benefit for Judah for a while in that they have a fairly good king. Remember, all kings are inconsistent because they are people. There is no king in the biblical record whatsoever who is perfect. No earthly king fits that context. All of them display their humanity all the time. Even at the moments where we assume that they are at the zenith, the highest point of their spiritual commitment. They are still carrying with them the baggage of their decisions and the reality of their humanity. Those are things that just don't go away. That being said, Hezekiah is very committed towards spiritual things, and he is kind of the rebound from the prior context. If you were to compare him to Ahaz, this is so much better. It doesn't mean, though, that everything's perfect. It means that it is so much better. And as it says in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, our fathers have trespassed and done evil in the eyes of the Lord. They have forsaken him. He goes on and would say, therefore the wrath of the Lord fell upon Judah and Jerusalem, and he has given them up to trouble, to desolation, and to jeering or complaint. Because of this our fathers have fallen by the sword, our sons, our daughters, and our wives are in captivity. Now it is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord God of Israel, that his fierce wrath may turn away from us. So Hezekiah is able to connect the dot and say, in the end, the problem isn't our might, wealth, or strength, it's our commitment to God. And so he's able to tie those pieces together for us and for Judah and further for all who would be part of Israel at this point. And his behavior then matches his confession. He cleansed the temple, restored worship, destroyed the idols in the land. He invited all the people, here's that phrase again, from Beersheba to Dan, to come and celebrate the Passover as they should have been doing. They came from all parts of Israel. And the text inclusive, especially in the chronicle account of the events, says that this was the first thing like it since the days of David and Solomon. So there is a glimmer of consideration given to, hey, this is how it should be, how it could be. Unfortunately for us, we are the Paul Harveys of the world in the sense we already know what's happened, right? So we already know the rest of the story. So this sounds like we're reading through it, this is like it's going to be great again. Because if you stop the story right here, and this was the Hallmark movie, you're like, oh, it's a wonderful ending, right? And the Passover is restored, and cut in print, send to the channels, everything's great. Unfortunately, we know that there is actually a couple of things in balance here. Balance on one end is Judah's captivity has already been predicted. God's already given that this is actually necessary for them to go into captivity. And keep in mind our mental comparison. Judah has, for the most part, been more attentive to trying to follow God as a kind of a wide range of effectiveness. Whereas Israel had been far less desirous of that, if at all, for the most part, in their divided kingdom context. And so we'd be like, well, Judah still got a chance. And they did for quite a few years. But even that hourglass eventually ran out of sand, and the promise of captivity was going to be kept. And these Hezekiah-based reforms are taking place in Judah really during the last days before Israel's fall. And so this is all kind of thinking in terms of around the early 700 BC space. These little countries of the Palestinian range, including Edom, including Moab, including the Philistine-held regions, are all actually paying a massive tax. By every standard, it's a huge, onerous stripping of wealth from this region. And in antiquity and in like digging through archaeology, you can kind of see that's taking place. You can see the stripping of wealth from the area. Now, this is a moment where you can pause and think. This is an ebb and flow context. Before Israel returned to what we consider the return to the promised land that had been promised to their ancestor, the area of Palestine was not incredibly wealthy. It doesn't possess large, wonderful gold mines. And they don't have that. There's not this huge gemstone system in place where they can just kind of Minecraft their way 3 layers deep and all of a sudden we found all the diamonds. That's not going on either. That's not the case. There's not a lot of mineral right wealth there. Further, they don't have large stock space where they've got huge herds. That wasn't the case. They don't have a whole lot of farmable land. They don't have a lot of land to use as orchard space either. So where did their wealth come from? How are they so wealthy to be able to pay the tax for so long and in such volumes? In the biblical account, do we have any insight as to how Israel got wealthy?
Took it with them when they left Egypt.
Point number 1, they brought a lot with them. Whatever that was. And I love how the Bible account doesn't actually give us an accountable, quantifiable detail. It says, well, they brought with them 63 tons of this, 12 tons of that. What it says actually is everyone who was there gave them what they had. It gives us a nice picture rather than a ledger. Now, we do have ledger space that happens later, because what's the second time that Israel starts getting wealth that isn't from their land. During the reign of whom? Solomon, right? It went through substantial currency devaluation. That's fancy terms. It meant that the bracket of what you considered currency that you would trade and exchange, and like what had value, changed because there was so much of a thing. And so it went down from silver is really important and precious, right? Do we have a mineral in the U.S. that we used to think was super just not worth anything? We used to make coins out of it. Copper, right? Man, copper's just so worthless. So worthless, so much so that we can afford to take copper in our non-value-based economy of currency and say, we're going to make a coin out of it. All right? Do you realize that the coins we have now are not copper, right? And even the coins that have a higher value, that they keep changing the metals that are in there, trying to find cheaper and cheaper metals to make it not cost so much, because it's kind of silly to mint a penny that costs more than a penny, right? That'd be kind of silly. The same thing as quarters and all the coins. And that's how inflation functions. You kind of see that happened in the reign of Solomon, so much so that they're like, well, I don't care about silver anymore. We can't so if you're in a place where silver everywhere else is valuable, but not here, because we got so much of it, your economy is now getting supercharged with wealth. Everybody's got a lot of it. And this is not just a fiat currency system, which is our current 21st, 22nd century context. Probably will be the same way fiat going forward for quite a long time, where currency is an idealized value, not an actual thing. These are all actual things. So much of this that's not there. Now we get back to the other end of the life of Israel, and repeatedly they had engaged in behavior that was stripping the wealth of their nation. Not just in taxes, because there's taxes and there's basically bribes. The fancy term for bribes in the antiquity context is tribute. Slightly different than tax. We do the same thing, by the way. We do exactly the same thing when we send foreign aid to a country. Let's put this in context. When we send foreign aid to like Yemen, we're buying rights to their airfield. Or insert other nation. Because we want to land something there and we want to leave. And so we're paying a tax. We're paying tribute because we want to use their airspace or whatever it is. It's all the same thing. These are all the same equations. So God is now stripping and peeling off everything that Israel thought made them Israel. We're wealthy. We're powerful. We're wise because the temple is here and we worship God. Israel's leaders had stripped the temple of all its gold. Nearly every major U.S. city, for whatever reason, has a building that they've gilded the roof of in government context most of the time in gold, right? They don't really use gold at the same rate they used to do that, but it certainly looks shiny and looks like gold. It's a special thing. That's where the building is. Well, Israel was no longer going to have that. It's being stripped away. And in the course of the captivity that's taking place and the attacks that are going on, well, now it will become even more sorrowful for them because the very structure itself is going to be bearing the brunt of their rebellion. So Ashdod and Egypt then make a coalition against Assyria. We talked about this a couple weeks ago. So you have one major power on the one side of them, another major power on the other side of them. They no longer have a substantial military. They no longer have much wealth because it's been taxed out of their system. They no longer have the spiritual fortitude that they once had. They no longer have the numbers as a people they once had. And above them is one giant rock. And below them is another giant rock. And they are in the middle. They will again be crushed. Slowly sawn into bits. It's at this time that the kingship or the reign of Sargon of Assyria starts rising up. This is Babylon in its context. They rebel and set up an independent state, and then it becomes the conflict between Babylon and Nineveh. Eventually Babylon is subdued, and Nineveh becomes the more centralized space. Egypt is also doing the same thing, and so they desire kind of a buffer space from that. They encourage, this time, sending foreign aid into the little nations of the Canaanite area to rebel, and Isaiah strongly urged King Hezekiah to not listen to Egypt. So the outcome was kind of certain here. Hezekiah withholds his tribute from Assyria, and he fortifies himself for war. He picked a side. Historically and biblically, both of these nations end up being used as illustrations of spiritual rebellion in the literature of the prophets, both in the Old Testament and the New. These pictures reappear a lot, especially in Revelation, but also in the preaching of Jesus. Some of those monies that were sent up, these tributes, this foreign aid, this purchase of support, produced this. Mentioned it earlier. This is Hezekiah's tunnel. Very exciting, isn't it? Like, dude, that's a tunnel. Keep in mind that this is a hand-produced tunnel that provides a stable water supply for the fortification space of Jerusalem. As I've illustrated before, Bobby Williams could walk through that entire thing and not even be bothered at all. It's perfectly sized for Bobby. It is not perfectly sized for me. And so it's hard to kind of visualize here, but I just want you to imagine me crouched over, so much so that often my backpack that I was wearing is scraping along the ceiling of parts of this to kind of get a visual. And if you want to have a side-by-side comparison, maybe after class we can have Bobby and I stand, and I'll bend over to get close to Bobby's side and not be injured as much as I was otherwise. When I emerged from the tunnel, it was victorious. So this sets up the stage, though, for really kind of the closing arc of Hezekiah's rule. He's accepted his situation. He's engaged himself in a way to serve spiritually well, but he's still making these political alliances that are going to have consequences past his lifetime. 14th year of Hezekiah's reign, the armies came en masse, this time under King Sennacherib. He destroyed the city of Tyre, then Joppa. He met and defeated an Egyptian army along the way. He laid siege to Judah's walled cities. There was a number of them. And it says in his own literature, Sennacherib's prison in particular, they shut up Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. Some of those armies then, as armies would do, sent out foragers and stripped all of the food from the land and all of the supplies from the land. Because from an army's perspective, it is far more efficient in this era to take your supplies from your enemy than it is to carry them with you. It's a supply line and logistics concern of military forces. So realizing his danger, Hezekiah then sends a huge tribute to the king who is camped at Lachish. He strips the gold from the walls of the temple for resources. That was not enough. He's like, no, that's not going to work. This is right here, some of the photos of the city of Lachish. This is one of the archaeological sites where you can kind of see all of this. I've shown this before. This is at Lachish where they represent all the kings of Israel to the last edge of this divided kingdom space. The height of the chairs shows the length of their reign, how long they reign from beginning to end. But on the bottom part of the chart, you can kind of see right here, this is one of the walls that was built during the reign of Hezekiah. And they put all the rocks back up. They rebuilt the wall archaeologically to represent what it would have been like during the reign of Hezekiah. And so you can also kind of see another detail in this wall. So as you're looking at this site right here, what you're actually also seeing is the remains of what was the siege ramp. So when Sennacherib and the forces came up upon this particular city, they did the style of conflict that was common in the area. They had to get up to the gates, and so they built a giant earthen siege ramp all the way up to the door. Now that's a slow, laborious process. Two things are happening when that takes place. Number one, everyone's getting scared inside the city, hoping they'll go away. And as they're scared inside the city, what happens to their food and water stores? And they keep going down and down. Generally, most everybody on the strategic side is hoping that the people on the inside give up because they run out of food or they run out of water. But they build the siege slowly until they get to the point where they can try to make entry, and they do, and they actually raise the city. Lachish is one of the last fortified cities in this area to fall in this conflict, and it serves as a good historical timepiece, if you will, to bridge a lot of the other events of the era around. This is Sennacherib's prison. It's actually a copy of it that's housed at the Isaac, that used to have a different name, but it is at a museum on the campus of the University of Chicago. The original of this one is over in London at the British Museum. It details, though, for our purposes, the Assyrians' warfare and success against Jerusalem. This is where we find the contemporary historical accounts of the kings of Assyria saying, we've got Hezekiah pinned up like a bird in a cage. And so you guys have a nice folding together of history, biblical literature, connecting into reality. Judah now is in serious trouble. Everything looks horribly lost. Hezekiah then goes to Jehovah in prayer, and God answers with a promise. Strikes down the Assyrians with his power, not man's. Sennacherib would awake in the morning to find 185,000 of his soldiers deceased. He would withdraw and never return. Jerusalem was spared for about 100 years, but the cost of that was substantial. Sennacherib's records boast of 46 walled cities and forts taken during that time. So all of that security and safety that makes a city in antiquity strong and a culture strong are just gone. And when they do that, they don't leave it there, they pull it back with them. Rich, did you have something?
Did Sennacherib's prison detail the 185,000?
So no, it does not. Like all
I suspect so.
boasting of the king, almost all of these prisms, monuments, steels, they all only chronicle victories. There's very few of them that actually mention defeats. And so in the sense of how historians work through things, everyone's like, well, that's not surprising, because that also doesn't list all of his other failures too, which they know from other histories. Because the way they figure that out is they go find the victorious king who beat him, and then they go, okay, here's over here, and antiquity shows this guy saying he did this thing. We've got archaeological evidence of him destroying these cities. But that king who beat him doesn't list his losses either. It is a super uncommon thing for this era and in general to memorialize defeat. It's just something that most cultures simply don't do. They might teach about it. If you go to war colleges, even in antiquity, they talk about defeat as a sense of how do we not lose next time. But they don't usually approach it in this way. I think there may be some other antiquity accounts that are contemporaneous to Sennacherib's prism there that do shed light on some of those details. But for any nation in these eras, that's super rare. The biblical text actually, because it gives numbers, is actually an uncommon thing. That gives numbers of the size of these armies. It's uncommon in biblical literature. It's more common in written histories that show up around the 1st century and forward. Off the top of my head. But there's probably more. Rich also illustrates a basic truth. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you're going to have to raise your hand because there's no other method by which I can discern your interest to ask said question or comment. So you just raise and I'll stop and we'll answer the questions and move forward. So that's the best practice. You can also wave both hands. That's probably a useful thing. It gets my attention very well. So you're kind of seeing a picture here develop in these two maps. This is our geography side. So we have Canaan during the tribal strength period at its zenith. This is maybe thinking of it in terms, for our perspective, as right before Saul. Just think, even though the map kind of overlaps well with the reign of Saul, think about it in that context. So now you have a unified people, unified under the law of God, and they have a strong hold on the region. They've begun the process of picking out the idolatry in the area, and the potential is good. By the time we get to the last gasp of Judah, Judah itself is just a scraggle of things. Think about the topography and geography of that Judean region right there. What kind of land is that? If you think back to when we began the study, what's going on in that south of Jerusalem area? Let me see if I can get our thinker to think. So here's a little space right here. What's at the center of that? Dead Sea. What kind of things can live in the Dead Sea? It's a simple answer.
Nothing.
Not a thing. What lives on the banks of the Dead Sea? Not a thing. Rocks. Rocks and minerals and salt. This is mineral, but it's a more notable mineral. So in that area then, you've got this Dead Sea space, nothing living there. To the west of the Dead Sea, the topography has it going straight kind of up, and it becomes visually the equivalent of how we think a lot of the American Southwest looks in regards to like New Mexico and Utah, with these sheer cliffs and water-carved landscape. Is that a place where you really want to build a farm? Maybe you put some cattle there if you can move them somewhere with food, but you don't. And it's actually not as stable as that region, because all of the water-carved caves that are in that area of the raised plateau constantly are falling in on each other. And so there's this kind of accordion-like house of cards system that takes place when the water carves out a low cave. It creates the equivalent of what we think a sinkhole functions like, and everything above it goes, just drops down. That's the area, by the way, where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls. See, Dead Sea, it's right next to it, so that's why it's called that. And that biblical site and place there is where, in the time frame that's about to come, that is the intertestamental period, right south of Jericho and approximately east of Jerusalem, the community of Qumran existed, and where they hid their biblical records in those particular caves. When they were exposed later, because of this system of erosion, where a young shepherd boy was just doing what young boys do and climbing the caves, found it. Threw a rock and it broke one of the containers they were held in. So now you have that area. You've got that space where there's nothing going on there. If you move over to the other side of the mountain's edge, and you start going in the valleys and go down towards Lachish and down to Beersheba, it's a farmable area. It's rain dependent, but it is not as verdant, not as sustainable as the upper section of Galilee, which is fully functional as an independent community, and Dan would be. So now you have Judah living in an area that cannot self-sustain itself in the ways that it once did. It doesn't have the ability to do so. This is also a time period where things start to change in Israel. People start to use the language of their oppressors. Now that's not a big deal unless all of your spiritual literature has been only written in one language for all of its eras. And that language is one of the key designators that create community, all the way back to the Tower of Babel. So language ties us together, especially so spiritually. And, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but portions of your biblical text are written in this language too. It starts to show itself up.
So a question, is that a translation or is that original?
So it is presumed in the text of Daniel to be original to it. In the middle section of Daniel, the language just shifts from Hebrew to ancient Aramaic and then back. And this is not the language of later Aramaic, which is a different language altogether. This is Akkadian is actually the language of thinking about it in more practical terms. So all of a sudden, you have this language show up in the midst of a document that's all Hebrew otherwise. It happens in the biblical accounts. We don't see it as English readers because how many of us read Akkadian or Aramaic? I do not either, by the way. I can press a button and see what it says. It's not one of my preferred language of antiquity. I just read it in English. But I know what's going on there, and it's actually very close to Biblical Hebrew. The languages are super similar in the way they function. A lot of the words are the same. They actually, over the years of the text, steal words from those languages, just like we do with English. So they're shared language words. So what that's going on now is we have a context where these people who once had spiritual identity and spiritual uniqueness have lost much of that. This is also where the phrase starts to show up that we become accustomed to of what quantifies as a Jew. Now remember, when we began the study, we identified this reality with all ethnically connected labels. These labels often exist attaching to multiple aspects of an individual's identity. So, in the term Jewish, and we're thinking now specifically in antiquity, not 21st century, I'll talk about that in a second. That term applies to two groups of people from about this point forward. Grouping number one, it's anyone who is ethnically, by the basis of their genetics or the culture of which they are being raised within, to be self-identified and exteriorly identified as Jewish. So in this context, this would be someone from Judah who also had all the cultural and physical trappings of being from that area. Note, because of the way that the population has intermingled over the eras, even arriving to this point, everybody kind of looks the same. This is not a disposition of, well, I can tell they're Jewish because of the shape of their nose. No, that's not the case. They're from the right region, they have the right language, they have the right mannerisms, and their face looks like everybody else's face, but there's obviously some ethnic differences. So ethnic. But it also overlaps to the spiritual communal identity. Because one did not have to be ethnically Jewish to be identified as a Jew, even inside the biblical account. In the Old Testament text, there are multiple converts to Judaism referred to in the Old Testament, where they ethnically are something else, or maybe really close, but they choose to become what the Bible calls a proselyte. And even in the New Testament text, do we encounter someone who is from a different region altogether, but he's clearly now Jewish? Paul's ethnically outsider. He's ethnically he's not 100% Jewish in the way we think. What about this Ethiopian guy? That's also clearly not ethnically Jewish. Paul says his heritage is mixed. He's like, I was born over here, but I've got a family line that's Jewish, and I have affirmed my Judean and Israelite Jew spiritual heritage. Same thing for our eunuch. They are all now being wedded together into the tree or branch that is in Christ. In your Bible translations, by the way, and I've used the King James here because it's a great usage of it in antiquity. 2 Kings 16:6 is where this term shows up there. So that talks about it then. Today we have the same trappings in our culture as well. We have individuals who are ethnically Jewish. They exist in every nation at this point to a certain degree for all kinds of reasons. And in their mind, and this is true about their particular perception of their culture, They don't use percentages of ethnicity like we sometimes do because of DNA testing. So someone either is or isn't Jewish. And so that's how they see themselves. Even if the rest of their ethnicity physically is all the other things, they self-identify in the ethnic box of Judaism as Jewish. But we also use that term to refer to a grouping of religious ideals. So you have probably 3 or 4 major segments of Judaism that exist in our spiritual world culture around us. The 2 most common, though, are those who would fit into 2 brackets. A very liberal bunch that are nominally morally Jewish. They read their Torah. They are the ones who, by comparison, would show up during the Hanukkah festivals and some of the high festivals in Judaism, much like we have individuals who we may know only show up to church contexts on Easter and Christmas. All right, so that you have that bracket. The rest of them actually have their lineage going basically straight line back. Modern Judaism finds its roots into what we would consider the Pharisees. And so that's just kind of how that thread goes. Again, now that modern group doesn't identify itself on the basis of a person's ethnicity. Someone can convert to those groups just as they could then. The reason that's important is because just like it's important to know the context of a letter or a manual on how to drive mules has some context, these biblical accounts have context for us too. And our goal isn't just getting the knowledge into our brain about the history and geography of the biblical story. It's to translate that information to improve our faith and, wait for it, improve our witness, the way in which we testify concerning the Christ. And so just as much as it's important to know what God wants us to do, the more and more equipped we are to understand what's going on in someone else's life, lets us ensure that we're highlighting the scriptures in the way that they need, without getting in the way by using phrases or terms that block that message from landing. The clock and our master clock keeper says I've got just about a minute left. So that's all we're going to cover in the context for today. There's not much more in this particular fall. It just drops incrementally. And we'll continue our study next Sunday. In the last minute, any last thoughts? Any things that stood out to you when you were paying attention to this? Standard rule, though, applies. If you got questions, come talk to me afterwards. In the class, the standard rule applies. Raise your hand. Interject. Totally fine, totally cool to do so. We'll go ahead and stop right here then. Thank you for your attention and your participation this morning.